What's going on, guys? This is Rob, and we are covering Extreme Carnage, which is a story that you guys have been screaming at me to cover. No pun intended. But you guys have been yelling at me to cover this, and honestly, I was kind of waiting until we got around to the release of the Venom 2 film. Now, this story is 8 issues long, so we're going to split it in half. So we're going to cover the first half here, then the second half probably later on today. So the whole thing behind this is really kind of a follow-up to The King in Black. It really does involve Carnage, but it also involves the symbiotes of the Life Foundation. And we'll kind of explain that a little bit once we get into it. But one of the first things that happens here is it basically shows us that the Carnage symbiote, at least a piece of it, is still alive and well. Now, the Carnage symbiote in and of itself is kind of a threat to a degree. What made the Carnage symbiote so insane and dangerous was its bonding to Cletus Cassidy. But Cletus Cassidy's gone. With this Carnage symbiote there, what it actually ends up doing is there's a couple things going on. The first is you have a kind of father and son duo, right? You've got Peter Krane and Arthur Krane. And Peter Crane's basically a senator trying to make his bones, make a name for himself when it comes to the presidency. And one of the things you guys are aware of when it comes to politics is that usually politicians, their job is to tell you what you want to hear so you'll elect them. And then when they get into office, they execute whatever previously established agenda they had in mind, before they ever ran for office in the first place. But the other part of this is that you have the Carnage symbiote that bonds itself to a fish. And then using that fish, it bonds itself to a great white shark, which, by the way, just looks horrifying, right? Just a great white shark with the Carnage symbiote just looks absolutely terrifying. But this shark quite literally lunges on board a Somali pirate ship and ends up bonding itself to one of the Somali pirates. And then in turn, all these Somali pirates are killed, and then it bonds itself to another guy, and then it leaves, right? So literally it's a chain reaction kind of thing. Now, one of the things that I do want to specify here, this is one of the things that makes the symbiotes themselves so incredibly versatile. I wouldn't really say dangerous, so much as versatile. As most of you guys know, they do have sentience, they can think for themselves, but if a symbiote is dead set on being returned to a host, it'll start jumping through different bodies to get to that point, right? Everybody and everything can serve as a means for a symbiote to travel. And so what you end up doing is kind of transitioning back to this kind of campaign rally by Peter Krane, where he basically kind of goes on this speech about how the different things that have happened in recent years, right? The idea of these symbiotes kind of running awry, the King in Black, different things like that, right? The whole Empire event, which we didn't cover because that story sucked. Like all these different things that are going on, that they all kind of tie into this idea that humanity is essentially under threat from like an extraterrestrial race. Now, the reality of this is that's not really the case, but as a politician, his job is to feed on the fears and the uncertainty of the general public in order to get them to elect him into office, right? Because nothing is more effective than fear. But one of the revelations he throws out here is that we all have to take action, right? Something has to be done. What are we going to do about these Tony Starks and these Charles Xaviers, anybody who harbors aliens and so on? And so what he says is that he's announcing a partnership with the newly reorganized and refocused Friends of Humanity. Now, as soon as that was revealed, I was like, what? The Friends of Humanity? Okay, so here's the thing. Friends of Humanity is old school, right? Like, unless you're an old school X-Men fan, you will have no idea who the Friends of Humanity are, right? The Friends of Humanity, the Right, right? That kind of a thing. These were basically groups, specifically the Friends of Humanity was basically a group that was rooted in what was in effect bigotry, right? These guys hated anybody who was a mutant that was not a baseline human, and they would launch attacks, they would do all kinds of stuff, right? Anybody who wasn't like them or anybody who didn't believe what they believed, they would go after. Now, one of the big things about this is that it was initially launched by a guy named Graydon Creed, and Graydon Creed was actually the non-powered son of Mystique and Sabretooth. And it was kind of crazy because Mystique literally banged Sabretooth without Sabretooth knowing that she was a mutant. And then in turn, she gave birth to Creed and then put him up for adoption. But he had this just staunch anti-mutant perception. Now, when it all came to a head, that's when Friends of Humanity began to really lose credibility super fast. And for the most part, it's been a joke for years. But to see the Friends of Humanity coming back is nuts. I loved the Friends of Humanity as a concept. But one of the things that Peter Krane is doing here is basically introducing something called the Birthright Act. Basically saying that those individuals who are not born on Earth cannot be here on Earth, right? They have to kind of be pushed away and forced to leave. And it's one of the things that he kind of addresses, right? He's like, in this world that we live in this political climate that we live in, you have those individuals out there who are basically nothing more than like John Turturro in Miller's Crossing when he was begging for his life, right? That's all they are, right? Like they have no real teeth. There's nothing they can really do. It's just, you have to look into your heart. And if it can't be done with a strongly worded letter, they just don't worry about it, right? And then you have people who actually get things done. And Peter Krane is one of those guys who sees himself as somebody who gets things done. He's like, while they're out there doing their little protests and writing their strongly worded letters and hoping people look into their hearts and realize that their heart is 3 sizes too small, we're gonna actually get stuff done. And so that's one of the things that makes them such a menace here, or such a threat here, is because following that, of course, they end up going into their kind of meeting place, and it's like, well, it all kind of went pretty well, and that kind of a thing, your stream went fine, and the normal kind of rigmarole that you see when it comes to politics, right? Making sure that the message resonates with the audience. The biggest problem they have here is they're still part of they're still really attached to a fringe audience, because most people in the general public don't really consider the events of King in Black to be like a global threat, right? The symbiotes are a global threat because it was basically taken care of. And so what he needs to do is kind of expand his message out to the larger general public. And it's going to be kind of crazy because this gets instigated in one of the most insane ways ever. But what we end up doing here is actually switching over to a guy by the name of Dr. Miller. Now, Dr. Miller was the guy who was on the Somali pirate ship who was attacked by the Carnage symbiote, which, as we basically know now, the symbiotes bonded to him. The crazy thing about this is that as his chauffeur is kind of looking through his phone, he gets a text message from a guy named Dr. Miller. And this is kind of like, what? And then, as soon as that happens, right, Carnage realizes the jig is up and takes his kid out, right? Just completely consumes and destroys this kid. Now, switch over to probably one of the most important characters of the entire story, Flash Thompson. Now, here's the thing. For those of you guys who never saw our videos, or really any of our Venom videos, Flash Thompson, of course, as most of you guys know, was the bully of Peter Parker when he was in high school. The first real host of the Venom symbiote was Eddie Brock. Later on, after Flash Thompson lost his legs in wartime conflict, the symbiote was kind of restructured and then bonded to him, and he basically became Agent Venom, and had what really is one of the most celebrated Venom runs in the history of Marvel Comics, right? People love Agent Venom, right? Agent Venom was a really, really cool story, and I think we covered a little bit of it, and we should probably cover the rest. I don't know if you guys are interested in seeing that or not, but the important thing here is that Flash Thompson had basically died, but during the events of King in Black, he was brought back, and then he was bonded to the anti-Venom suit. And so basically, it's a symbiote suit that can actually cure people, right? But it was just kind of a way to bring Flash Thompson back and make him into somebody else, which is really, really cool. But the crazy thing about this is Flash Thompson is working as a charity worker now, right? I mean, he's basically helping to unload boxes, things like that, to charity organizations and so on and so forth, with a friend of his named Hank, when suddenly he's met by the arrival of Carnage. Now, Carnage does not actually show up to Flash Thompson. Instead, what he does, he takes the consciousness of Flash Thompson and brings it to Carnage himself. So what Carnage has basically learned to do here is exactly what Null the symbiote god learned to do, which was basically take people's consciousness and bring them to him. And so what he does is he communicates with Flash Thompson like, I'm not dead, man. Cletus Cassidy's dead, but I, the Carnage symbiote, am still very much alive and well. And you have to rejoin me, right? You have to come back. You've got to be part of my symbiote hive, right? The Carnage is basically trying to grab all these different symbiotes and consolidate them back under himself. Now, without Null there, and presumably without Venom being aware of what's going on here, this would make Carnage a highly dangerous threat. How he would stand against somebody like Venom in his current form, kind of being like a universal force, we don't fully know. What we do know is that Flash is not a chance, right? And is able to overcome the Carnage symbiote. This is one of the big kickers about this, right? When Carnage mentally possesses a person, he in turn controls their body. And that's why when Flash Thompson's mind is taken by Carnage, Carnage is able to control the body or the symbiote of Flash Thompson, and he almost kills Hank. But Flash is able to basically regain his sanity or regain his mind long enough to where he's able to stop himself and then basically take off, only to bump into Iron Man. Now, when he meets up with Iron Man here, this is kind of the cool thing. Iron Man, of course, kind of shows the symbiote hybrid armor that he'd been building for a little while, which of course we were already aware of. But two, he's been tracking symbiote activity, and basically is kind of like, look, Carnage is back, right? Cletus Cassidy's dead, but Carnage is back, and it's seemingly going to try to find a new host somewhere. We don't know exactly how this is going to play out. And so what you end up having is this, again, Tony Stark kind of putting Flash Thompson in the direction of Peter Krane and saying, this guy's a legitimate threat. We don't really know what's going on with him, but one way or another, somebody needs to find out. And given your history as being like an agent, you're the person best suited to do this. And so what ends up happening here is Flash Thompson actually goes to a campaign rally of Peter Krane. And as that happens, he's suddenly met by the voice of Carnage, right? And the voice of Carnage kind of tries to, intimidate him a little bit, kind of talk to him a little bit, sort of mess with his mind, kind of play a little bit of a few of the mind games here. And while all that's going on, Peter Crane's looking directly at him, right? And then you have Flash, who turns into anti-Venom and then immediately goes after Peter Krane. Now, of course, he's stopped by the forces of Peter Krane, but the important thing here is that Flash comes up on this very, very significant realization where he believes the Carnage symbiote has bonded itself himself to Peter Krane, and that Peter Krane is basically possessed by Carnage, right? He's the new host, which is kind of interesting because if that were the case, right, if that were actually the case, one, it would explain the motivations of Peter Krane in terms of why he's doing what he's doing, and two, it would give him a huge playing field, because what it would mean is that if the Birthright Act goes through and any alien race that exists out there is forced to leave the world, that means the advanced technology or the advanced intelligence those alien races offer would likely be forced to go as well, which would basically clear the playing field. Because if you have Carnage who's able to operate in free reign, albeit in secret, he can bond himself to some insanely powerful people. He can even spread himself. We know that much just from the events of Absolute Carnage, right? He's able to kind of implant himself in different people and turn them into what are basically copies, but servants of himself, and then in turn expand his sphere of influence across the world, i.e. conquer Earth, seemingly in the same way that Null the symbiote god did, right? And so what you end up doing here is you actually switch over to Alchemax, right? Now Alchemax, as a lot of you guys may or may not know, is a pretty significant organization. It's more significant in the future, in like the 2099 universe where Miguel O'Hara, Spider-Man 2099 comes from, than it is here in the modern era. But they're by and large just like this massive conglomeration, right? They're not like Roxxon, where like Roxxon has its hand in like every criminal act ever, but Alchemax will become that way, right? And so that's the kind of lingering threat that Alchemax poses. But the other part of this is Alchemax has been engaged in a lot of different nefarious things, creating monsters, creating beings out there, some of which can be used for military application, others necessarily not the same way. But what this does is it focuses on the character of Scream. And Scream, of course, is one of the Life Foundation symbiotes. Now, this is an important thing that I want to discuss here. So the Life Foundation, as most of you guys know or may be aware from the original Venom film, was basically a kind of organization that existed out there in order to find a way to either subdue, create, or use symbiotes in some form or fashion. In Marvel Comics, it was really more rooted in the Cold War, but the characters of Riot, Lasher, Phage, and Scream are the result of the Life Foundation, basically taking pieces of Venom and then making symbiotes out of that, right? Now, the Life Foundation symbiotes have a somewhat tumultuous history in Marvel. They were really interesting during the like original Lethal Protector run. The biggest problem that you have with this is that interest in their characters waned pretty fast, and they kind of fell to the background. I'm pretty sure we have a video explaining these guys. The important thing here is that there was a point where they basically became hybrid, but more recently, when it came to Marvel Comics, specifically during the King in Black, is there was a girl named Sadie. Now, Sadie was a girl whose family was basically breaking up, and the idea here is that Sadie wanted to keep her family together. And so during the King in Black and Absolute Carnage story, what actually ended up happening here is that the concept of hybrid, the 4 Life Foundation symbiote members had basically bonded together into a single symbiote and then bumped into Sadie, and then ultimately went into her home and bonded themselves to each member of her family. And then in turn, they had basically been taken over by Carnage during the events of Absolute Carnage, and then forced to go out and find all these other individuals out there who have been bonded to symbiotes over the years and who have a kind of remnant of the symbiote itself in the form of a codex in order to take them and bring them to Carnage. By and large, this worked until they ran into Reed Richards of the Fantastic Four from an alternate reality, and then basically they were all defeated, right? Then they were split apart, and they just kind of went and did their own thing for a little while, right? And so this is really kind of the first time that you're seeing the Life Foundation symbiotes re-emerge post King in Black / Absolute Carnage. The only real exception here is when it comes to Scream, right? She had bonded to Andi Benton. And if we're being honest with ourselves, we're better off doing a full-on character explanation of Andi Benton, just given the nature of how involved she is. But the long and short of this is that she is both the host of a symbiote as well as a person who possesses a hell mark, basically meaning that at some future point in time, she could become a Hell Lord similar to Mephisto. I don't know if she'd really be as powerful, but nonetheless, she has the ability to use Hellfire. Now, she doesn't like being bonded to Scream, but it's one of those things where they kind of have a mutual benefit by staying together, right? And so the result of this is that as this all goes down, as soon as the Scream symbiote overhears the kind of speech that Peter Krane was making to the general public, that suddenly the Scream symbiote basically starts going insane. Seemingly, it puts off this idea that there was a kind of subliminal message, right? It lends credence to the idea that Peter Krane really is possessed by the Carnage symbiote, because as Peter Krane speaks, it's actually the Carnage symbiote who's speaking, or at least that seems to be the case, and is basically sending out a message to all the symbiotes that are out there, and because they all share a similar DNA, using that as a way to, in effect, hijack the symbiotes and then force them back to him. And so that's why a kind of internal fight happens between Scream and between Andi Benton. Now, in the midst of all this, Carnage does exactly what he did with Flash Thompson, which is take the mind of Andi Benton and snatch it up and whisk it away way to the quote-unquote hive mind, right, where Carnage kind of reigns supreme. You could call it a kind of ethereal place, not physically tangible, but more or less in the mind. And that happens as Carnage just kind of takes over and communicates with Scream at the same time, talking to Andi. And so one of the crazy things that happens here is that he basically kind of tells Scream, Andi Benton never wanted to be bonded to you, right? You never wanted to be bonded to Andi Benton. So at the end of the day, why not leave and why not join me? But ultimately, Andi Benton succeeds in freeing herself from Scream's control. The problem is doing this requires her to invoke her Hellfire. And when that happens, because Hellfire injures Scream takes this as an affront that, Carnage was right. You were never on my side, right? Like, you were never a friend of mine. Like, you burned me with your Hellfire. And basically she ends up burning off the entirety of the Scream symbiote itself, right? Like, it's completely and totally gone. And so that's when Andi's basically just left by herself, right? It's her and the Scream symbiote's completely gone. Now, the funny thing about this is that it reveals this aspect of Andi Benton that we weren't really aware of, that where Andi Benton seemed to hate being bonded to the Scream symbiote, the symbiote seemed to hate being bonded to her, but they stayed together because it was just mutually beneficial, that actually Andi Benton had learned to love her symbiote, right? The symbiote that she had, she'd kind of grown attached to, much in the same way that Eddie Brock had grown attached to the Venom symbiote. But the important thing here is that with Andi Benton just kind of without a symbiote, these guys don't know that, right? That these kind of guardsmen are unaware of that, and they in turn go to attack her believing she has a symbiote unto herself. And so of course, where she's able to hold her own and basically take these guys out, that what you end up doing is switching over to Phage, right? Now Phage, again, another member of the Life Foundation symbiotes that's kind of been free floating out there, had basically bonded itself to a dog. And a lot of that's because it did that when it was part of the Sadie family, right? It bonded itself to Sadie's dog. And what it's been doing is basically living alongside a guy named Cash Buckman. But the cool thing here is that when the message goes out again from Peter Krane, so you guys are kind of seeing this common theme, that the symbiote actually, or at least the dog, attacks Cash Buckman and basically kills him. And then from there goes forward, seemingly to go after or to locate Carnage. Now at this point, we pick up with a guy by the name of Dr. Steven, right? Now Dr. Steven was a really interesting character. He was originally introduced in Venom 151. The importance of Dr. Steven is that following the events of Flash Thompson as anti-Venom and going into Eddie Brock kind of getting the Venom symbiote back for a period of time, that what this led to was the Venom symbiote kind of becoming far more violent than it had been before. And so the desire of Eddie Brock was to find out why this was happening. And so ultimately he ended up meeting with Dr. Steven. And ultimately one of the things that took place here is that a conflict ensued in Spider-Man 792 and really the alpha issue of Venom Incorporated, and basically led to a couple different things. One, Flash Thompson became anti-Venom for the very first time. And two, this basically led to Dr. Steven kind of being a massive authority when it came to the nature of symbiotes. Now he kind of already was to a degree in the sense that he was head of Alchemax's astrobiology team, but his experience with the anti-Venom suit, with the Venom symbiote, so on and so forth, has basically kind of made him a massive authority on it. The funny thing about this here is that when he's talking to basically Andi Benton as she's being held in place, that his whole statement is that I'm not necessarily here to cause you problems, like I'm here to try to find a way to basically save the Scream symbiote. So he's not really villainous per se. It's really more him just kind of being here, being used by Alchemax because of his experience with the symbiotes, and then just trying to, at the very least, prevent as much suffering as possible while he's doing his job. The problem here comes with Phage, which is basically bonded itself to both the dog and Cash Buckman, and as it shows up here, it immediately starts going and attacking Andi Benton. And the reason why is because with Andi Benton basically, seemingly destroying Scream the way that she did, that Phage takes this as a personal affront. Now, that's one of the things to know about the Life Foundation symbiotes, is that while they are kind of being brought in as part of Carnage's hive mind, they do share something of a hive mind themselves, right? In the sense that it's kind of a shared consciousness to a degree. Not in the sense that they operate under a singular mind, right? And they're just kind of facsimiles of this greater mind, but in the sense that they all kind of know what the other's doing. Now, part of this is because they're all basically derived from the Venom symbiote, but a lot of it's because of when they were merged as part of hybrid and different things like that, right? But at the end of the day, Phage takes it as a personal affront that essentially Andi Benton had more or less destroyed Scream, and the desire of Phage is to kill Andi Benton for killing Scream. Now, what you also have going on there is Flash Thompson as anti-Venom, who basically shows up at Alchemax only to meet Dr. Steven. And then that's kind of the crazy thing, is he doesn't attack him, right? Because Dr. Steven had helped Flash Thompson on a multitude of occasions, right? And so the desire here is to use, or at least to have Dr. Steven help him find a way to basically save Andi Benton. And so of course, with Phage facing off against Andi Andi, she's able to hold her own to a degree. The problem is that the hellfire of Andi Benton does not affect Phage the same way that it affected Scream. And it's one of these things where even Phage kind of hypothesizes and saying, like, I think the reason why it affected Scream is because Scream wanted to be destroyed, right? She wanted to basically be removed from you, or whatever the case happens to be. But the important thing is you basically have Flash Thompson, who shows up here to aid Andi Benton as best he can. But one of the things that goes on is that in this conflict, Phage basically impales Andi Benton by quite literally punching a hole through this chick, right? And so it's kind of crazy that seemingly this girl is killed. And that's one of the crazy things, is that each one of these symbiotes kind of has something to offer, and Phage in a lot of ways was just kind of unbridled strength, right? It was just sort of nuts. And so of course you end up having these forces of Alchemax who come showing up here, right, who are supposed to contain this whole thing, and it doesn't do any good, right? None of it really matters. I mean, at the end of the day, Phage just crushes all these guys. More so than that, of course, Flash Thompson isn't necessarily trying to kill these guys, but you know, I mean, if they get in the way, a few bullets kind of sprayed their direction, whatever happens, happens. The other important thing here is that there's actually an elderly man who's just kind of staying in this hospital, right? He's suffering with extreme dementia, and he's basically met by the Lasher symbiote, right? And the Lasher symbiote bonds itself to this guy. Now, the crazy thing is, as soon as that happens, right? As soon as the Lasher symbiote bonds itself to this guy, that you kind of have two things going on at the same time, right? You've got Phage, who's just killing all these guys at Alchemax, just ripping all these guys to pieces. And you've got Flash, who's trying to get Andi Benton out of there as fast as he possibly can. And then you've got the Lasher symbiote bonded to this old man with dementia, who's just killing everybody that he can come across, right? So like, it's exceedingly crazy and violent. And so what ends up happening here is Carnage tries to contact the Lasher symbiote, and then in turn says, like, come back to me, right? Now Lasher says no, like immediately shuts that down and says, no, not a chance. That's not going to happen. Now Lasher, I would always argue, is kind of the more intelligent of the four Life Foundation symbiotes, but because of the fact that it won't join his cause, what Carnage does is it communicates with the mind of the host and basically says, like, I can bring your memories back, right? You have dementia, you've essentially lost these giant chunks of your history. I can give those back to you, right? I can give you your family back. All you have to do is come to me. And so ultimately what ends up happening is the host actually forces the Lasher symbiote to basically follow its will and starts taking it to where Carnage is supposed to be. The whole time the Lasher symbiote is like, no, this is not what you think, right? Like, you think you're gonna go to Carnage and you think he's gonna give you your memories back, but that's not gonna happen, right? You take him and he's gonna take me, and then he's gonna kill you, right? That's exactly what's going to happen. Now, the other part of this is that for Andi Benton, right? I mean, she's got a giant hole in her chest, right? Like, her days are numbered. There's not a whole lot you can do here. And so with Flash Thompson taking her to Dr. Steven, what you actually end up learning here is Dr. Steven had done something interesting, that he had taken the anti-venom symbiote, or at least a portion of the anti-venom symbiote, and spliced its genetic structure and then bonded it with the Scream symbiote to create a whole new symbiote. And then in turn, that's taken and bonded to Andi Benton. And basically this symbiote kind of basically says, like, you know, it is the absence of Scream, right? The lack of Scream. That is the negative space of noise and the sound of silence, right? And that's basically what it calls itself. This is a wholly new symbiote, right? This is completely new, totally engineered. This symbiote has never existed before, right? So those of you guys who are kind of curious over the course of like Marvel Comics, how it is this symbiotes come into existence, truth to tell, there's no form or function to it, right? It just happens randomly. Sometimes it is the Venom symbiote leaving behind a kind of offspring in a prison cell that's inhabited by Cletus Cassidy, which bonds itself to Cletus and becomes Carnage. And sometimes it's a person splicing the DNA of two different symbiotes together and then creating a wholly new one. But what this symbiote is basically a merging between Scream and anti-venom, right? So it's kind of interesting they called it Silence. You think they would just call it anti-Scream, but I could definitely see why they would call it Silence, because anti-Scream is silence, right? So why not just call it Silence? And so while all that's getting on, we get this really, really brief moment, which I know a lot of you guys are going to absolutely love, right? Because it's one character that we've never talked about here on Comics Explained, but probably the best out of all the symbiotes out there, probably the most powerful out of all the symbiotes out there. You go to Staten Island, right? And you've got this kid named Bryn, and Bryn is watching TV. And it's symbiotes like, are all TV shows this boring and mundane? And Bryn's kind of like, I mean, yeah, basically like the kids shows are just boring as hell. And then they end up flipping to a station and everything's popping off at Alchemax. And then Bryn's like, I gotta go help my dad, right? And basically its symbiote kind of loads up and the two of them go taking off. Now, who is Bryn? Bryn is Toxin, and Toxin is amazing. I absolutely love Toxin. Toxin's like the best symbiote out of all the symbiotes. This dude is so OP, but the important thing here is switching back to Phage, right? Just kind of going on this rampage, that you actually get to see the full powers of Silence on display, where using its kind of anti-venom powers combined with its scream powers basically shuts down Phage, right? I mean, literally just overpowers this guy with a quickness. It's done so much so that really Silence looks like she kind of kills the host. And that's kind of the crazy thing. That's something that you don't really see all that often when it comes to symbiotes. Another symbiote being able to basically kill the host outright and in turn force the symbiote to leave that host and move on to somebody else, right? The symbiote serves as a kind of protection with these things. So it's kind of wild. And so what you actually end up having here is basically this host for Lasher, right? This old man that he basically ends up getting Lasher to take him directly to the Lincoln Memorial. And then as soon as that happens, he's like, release me, right? And basically just falls to his death and essentially dies. But his consciousness, kind of continues on. And so seemingly his consciousness is kind of trapped in the I guess the mindscape of Carnage. But of course, Carnage basically kills his consciousness, right? So basically this old man is officially dead. And because of this, what it does is it allows Carnage to take over the Lasher symbiote and then force the Lasher symbiote unto himself. With that being said, guys, we're gonna bring this to an end. Keep an eye out for part 2 coming later on today. Thank you guys for watching, and I will catch you all later. Peace.